Hey guys, it's Natalia and welcome back to another pattern and tutorial. It has been a long time coming that I actually put out another pattern. I always go so back and forth with these because I do know how to pattern make really well, and obviously I sew for a living. I've been doing it for so long, but sometimes I still get a little bit of imposter syndrome when it comes to putting out tutorials because I think there's just so many different ways that you could create a garment and sew it, and like people's processes are so different that I'm like, oh, what if I do it one way, but there's actually a better way to do it, whatever. I'm really hard on myself. So I'm gonna preface that and just say that maybe there's better ways to go about sewing this. If there is, feel free to share, but I'm really excited to put this dress out there. It's been a long time coming. I made this dress originally for my friend Lexy, hence why it's called the Lexy dress. And I made it for her as her graduation dress, and I then made it for myself for LA Climate Week. I shared a short form video on it and it went viral across all 3 platforms, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. So I figured it was time that I actually just put that pattern out. It's taken me a couple months, but I'm really excited about it. It comes with both versions, the sweetheart neckline and the normal neckline. And as far as the skirt length, you can make it whatever length you want. I know I make it very short, and I know a lot of people have plenty of things to say about that on the internet. I've gotten roasted about how short they are. I don't really care. I like it. And that's the beauty of sewing, is that you can make it however you want. So you can make it longer, you can make it shorter, you can do whatever you want. But if you buy the pattern, you'll notice it basically just comes with the bodice part, because the skirt bit is basically just a rectangle, and I just felt it was a waste of paper to like make a rectangle paper pattern when I could just like share the measurements and then you guys do it that way. So that's why the pattern does not come with a skirt. The pattern will be linked down below if you have not already bought it, and make sure that when you print it out, you print it out at 100% scale. It should work for both US letter size paper and also A4 size paper. So all that being said, let's get straight into the video.
Once you cut out your pattern, you should have 5 pieces that look like this. You can pretty much use any fabric that you want. I recommend something a little bit more lightweight. I'm using a nice satin, and then you're gonna need interfacing, Ridgeline boning, and optionally cups. You also do need a zipper, and I just forgot to put that in there. Personally, I'm somebody that likes to use the same fabric for the lining, but you can also just buy separate lining. But if you're using the same fabric, you're basically gonna cut out double of every single piece. So I'm already cutting on fold, which creates 2, but then you're gonna do that again. So you have basically 4 of each piece, except for the center front, which you'll only have 2 of because it cuts on fold. But if you're using a different fabric for the lining, then you'll just do 1 set for the normal fabric and 1 set for the lining. Now it's time to cut out the interfacing. I actually do have black interfacing. I know I showed a white one earlier, but I had black one, so I'm gonna use that. And you're gonna want just enough to cover the lining bit. So basically 2 of each piece, except for the center front, you just want 1 that's on fold. This is what all your pieces should look like, and now it's time to put the interfacing onto the lining, and make sure you're putting the side with the glue on the wrong side of the lining fabric. You're gonna wanna make sure that your iron has no steam going out and it's at the lowest setting so that you don't burn your fabric. And obviously I do like to actually iron out my pieces before I put the interfacing on them so that everything is nice and crisp. Now it's time to piece the bodice together, and I like to place out all of my pieces like this so I can really visualize how they're supposed to fit together, and then I'm going to start pinning it all right sides together. So we're putting together both the lining and the outer shell. I like to start with putting the center back to the side back to the side front to the middle front to the center front, and so forth until you have everything pinned. Make sure you're matching all of your notches and everything is lined up nicely. Because there are a lot of curves and edges to this, it's going to look like it doesn't line up perfectly, but once you sew it, it will. So don't be alarmed if it looks like the little corner bits are coming out about like an inch or so. That's meant to happen. Once that's all pinned, this is what it should look like. You might have to ease the curves the tiniest bit in the front, but for the most part, everything should line up really easily. And like I said, those little corner bits, it's fine if they are out. That is meant to happen. And now it's time to sew up all of the seams that we just pinned at 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and at the end of every seam. Once you've sewn everything down, you want to open up all of the side seams and iron them down so that everything has a nice and crisp finish for both the lining and the outer shell. This is what your pieces should look like with all of the seams nice and open. Now it's time to move on to the boning. So we're gonna set aside our outer shell and just focus on the lining. So this is the piece that has the interfacing. I'm gonna cut out my Ridgeline boning and basically cut a piece out for every single seam, but make sure that you leave about 1/2 inch at the top and the bottom of the seam. And then once you figure it out for one side, I like to just use that to cut out the same one on the other side just to make things faster. To add the boning, place it 1/2 inch down from the seam and then put your needle down at the very last little groove of the Ridgeline boning. Also make sure it's as centered as possible on your seam because it'll look cleaner on the other side once you make basically a whole rectangle around the seam. And for this, you're gonna wanna make sure that your stitch length is a little bit longer than usual. I like to do like a 3 if my usual is like a 2.2, just because again, it looks a bit cleaner on the other side, even though it's on the lining, so it'll be on the inside and nobody else will see it but you, but I like a nice clean finish. And look how nice this looks. I'm obsessed. Again, it goes on the inside, nobody else sees it but you, but it's so satisfying. Go ahead and do this for the rest of the seams. The only one that's gonna be the most difficult is the curved one. You're gonna wanna go as slow as possible and really make sure that you are expanding kind of the fabric as you go because you don't wanna create any sort of like gathers or bunches under it. So just be like very aware and try to go slowly and spread the fabric out as evenly as you can. But once you're done, it should look really, really satisfying. Now that our lining is prepped and so is our outer shell, we're gonna start placing them together. So I'm gonna put the outer shell on top of the lining and start matching it up at the seams. Once everything is pinned and ready to sew, go ahead and sew that at 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, and make sure to be careful with the boning. If you did it all correctly, the boning should not be in the way of your seam allowance, but work around it if you need to. You don't want to get too close to it, but just close enough. Now we're gonna understitch, so basically pull the seam allowance towards the lining, and then we're gonna make a stitch as close to the seam as possible on the lining side. Once we have that done, I like to go ahead and clip my seam allowance on the curves. It makes it a lot easier to flip over and for it to lay flat. I do also trim quite a bit of this because 1/2 inch is honestly quite a bit of a seam allowance, but I always like to give myself extra room, and you'll notice that it'll flip over a lot easier once you do this. You can also clip it before you do the understitching, but I honestly forgot, so I did it after. And then you're gonna wanna go ahead and iron it down so again, it looks nice and clean. At this point, the bodice is basically done, so this is a good time to fit it and make sure it is the right fit that you want. This is also a great chance to figure out if you want to add padding or not. I've made one without and one with, and honestly, I do prefer the one with, so this side has padding on it and this side does not. It does just add an extra layer of support, but also really good shaping. But again, I've done it with and without. It's kind of just up to you and your preference, but for this one, I am gonna add it in. Once I got the padding in place, I kind of marked where I wanted it to be for it to lay properly for me, because I do find everybody's chest kind of lays in a different place. So you just want to mark out where you feel it fits comfortably for you. And then I went ahead and sewed those down to the lining at basically just the 2 points where the cup meets the seam allowance, so that obviously I could sew onto the seam allowance and it not show on the other side. I did it really messily, I'm not gonna lie. I feel like it's kind of hard to do this in a nice clean way, but it's also just on the inside and only you are gonna see it, so it's really not that deep. But I just basically backstitched a couple times on there to make sure it stayed in place exactly where I wanted it to. For the sake of saving paper, I didn't make a pattern for the skirt because it's literally just a giant rectangle. The longer the rectangle, the more gathered and poofy the skirt will be. I like to take the full width of my fabric and cut out 2 rectangles that I then piece together for my skirt. The length of it depends on how long you want the skirt to be, so make sure to measure that length from your waist down. Since the bodice is a curved hem, you want to take the length from the highest point of it, which is the side seam at the waist. And of course, to play it safe, I always like to add an extra inch or so to the length, because you can always take off, but you can never really add. If you're using the full length of your fabric like I am, make sure to cut out the selvages so you don't use those in there. And then I'm gonna piece together both rectangles at that seam to make my giant rectangle that's gonna be the entire skirt. Once my two pieces are put together, I'm gonna go ahead and finish off the edges. So I'm gonna finish off the edges of that seam and then the very, very top seam as well, but I'm gonna leave the hem open because we're gonna have to cut it anyway, so we don't need to serge it just yet. Since we're at the serger, I'm also gonna go ahead and finish off the edges of the bodice. So I'm basically gonna do all the way around the bottom of it, the sides, all of it, just because my fabric frays quite a bit and it's kind of annoying and it's just nice to have cleaner edges. Now to gather the skirt, make sure you have the longest stitch length on your machine, and I'm gonna be using a gathering foot. You do not need to be using one, but these are life-changing. I just recently learned about them, and why have I taken this long to use them? I don't know. So if you have one, use it. If not, you can just gather like normal, but if you do have a gathering foot, you basically just gather like normal, but you kind of hold your fabric behind it, and then it kind of bunches up on its own, and it just makes the gathering process a little bit easier than having to like hand kind of gather and pull at the thread to do it yourself. So this worked really nicely for me, but again, it's not necessary. You can just do it like normal. Now it's time to distribute the skirt onto the bodice evenly. So I like to use that center seam as my guiding point, and I put that onto the very center of the skirt. So I pin that down and then I pin both of the sides, and then I just kind of distribute the gathers as evenly as possible throughout the rest of the bodice. It worked out really well for this exact like length, but sometimes you have to kind of push and pull the gathers a bit to make it as even as possible. But get that all pinned down as much as possible and ready to sew. The more pins, the better when it comes to gathering so that it doesn't move. Also make sure you pin this onto the outer shell and not the lining. Once all your pins are in place, you can go ahead and sew. Make sure to switch your settings back to a normal length stitch so it's not on a gathering stitch anymore, and sew at 1/2 inch seam allowance. This is what it should look like when you're done sewing it down. You can trim out this seam if it's getting a little bit too bulky, especially because it is a curve and all of that. But now it's time to get the zipper on there. I have a whole separate tutorial on how to do an invisible zipper if you are wondering how I do that. Once the zipper is on there, it should look something like this, so clean and so satisfying. And now we're just gonna finish off the seam at the bottom of the zipper. Again, 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down. Once that's in place, it's time to finish off the lining. So I'm gonna fold over the lining onto the outer shell, right sides together, and I'm gonna pin it at the zipper. Make sure that at the very bottom of the lining, you do fold it up so that when you sew it down, that edge is folded up and we can finish the lining nicely. And of course, you're gonna wanna do this on both sides. I like to switch presser foots to this really thin one. It really helps you get really close to the zipper. Basically, you're gonna want to feel out where the zipper is because you can feel it under, and sew right up next to it. And then to flip it inside out, we're gonna trim that little corner at the top so that we get a nice crisp edge. And this is what it should look like, a very nice clean finish on the zipper. To finish off the rest of the lining, I basically just fold up 1/2 inch of the lining and pin it to the skirt. Because this is a curve, I should have clipped it so that it sat a little bit nicer, and I don't know why I didn't, and I didn't think of it till like a day later. So I do recommend clipping the curves so that it lays flat and you're not kind of fighting the fabric as much as I was fighting with it, especially at this front curve. Obviously, again, it's on the inside. Does it have to be the most perfect thing in the world? No, but it is nice when you have a clean finish like this. Add as many pins as you need. We're gonna be hand sewing this, so you have have a little bit more flexibility with it. But basically I do an invisible stitch and I try to grab fabric from the seam as much as I can instead of the actual skirt itself, if that makes any sense. But also the skirt is so gathered that if like the stitch shows through, it's really not gonna show through either way. But yeah, again, I do recommend clipping the seam a bit more. I don't know why I didn't. I think it would have made my life a lot easier. But yeah, just go ahead and sew it all the way through to finish off the lining. The very last step is the hem, and obviously since the bodice is curved, the hem is also currently curved. So you can do whatever you want with the hem. If you want a curved hem and asymmetrical hem, you can keep that, but I like to pin the front and try to even it out with the back as much as possible. So this is obviously where you determine your length and you can kind of figure it out as you go. It's a lot easier if you have somebody else helping you do this because it's very hard to pin something onto yourself and make it like perfectly even, but I did the best I could, try to even it out to my liking, and then I cut it keeping in mind the 1/4 inch hem that we're going to be doing. You can do whatever kind of hem you want. I like to go simple and just serge the whole entire thing and then flip it up 1/4 inch and sew it down. You could also just do like a double fold hem. You could do a hand sewn hem. You could do whatever you want. It really is not that deep. It also probably depends on the fabric that you're using, but this is always my simple way out. And once you're done with that, you're done with your dress.
That is it for today's tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you do end up making this dress, let me know down below or send me pictures, tag me in it. I would love to see your recreations of this. And let me know what other patterns you want to see from me, any sort of specific designs or dresses, maybe things I've designed in the past that I just haven't put the pattern out for. Let me know. I would love to be doing more of these. I don't know how consistently I'm going to be putting out patterns, but I would like to do it a little bit more so. If you want to see more from me, peer pressure me to put more out, because peer pressuring me to put out patterns does work, because everybody peer pressured me to put out this pattern and here it is. So subscribe for more if you're not already so you don't miss out on the next videos, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!